Well, good morning, everyone. I'm not very much for standing behind podiums, and I therefore hope that I'm not too terrible a target for the cameras, which are going to be recording these plenary sessions to share with colleagues who could not be here, particularly those in developing countries. Let me add my words of welcome to you all, and also let me add my words of thanks to the organizing committees that are hosting us in this beautiful city of Prague. I'm not Tom Cruise, so this is not going to be a Hollywood production. But I hope that in the few minutes that I have, I will share with you some of the work that my group has been working on, and it has to do with volatiles in the mantle. When I was preparing this talk, a friend of mine told me that this was my opportunity to do two things. Number one was to say something very speculative, and number two, to make sure that I insult somebody. I don't know about the second, but I will certainly be sure to say something speculative about the mantle and how the mantle melts. Okay, so do we have slides? Okay, I promise we did go through this morning, so if this is a Hollywood production, it's going to be take two. Okay, so should I keep talking? Okay, this worked a moment ago, and hopefully it will come back in just a minute. Anyway, so what I'm going to tell you is that there have been various approaches to trying to understand how the mantle melts. Some has been experimental work, and some of it has been making measurements on a number of mantle-derived materials. And this morning, what I'm going to try and share with you is work we've done on melt inclusions, primarily in olivine hosted melt inclusions. If you had the opportunity to read my abstract, which has several different co-authors besides myself, you will discover that we are finding startling amounts of water. So I'll give you my conclusions first. I think somebody is trying to tell you something from back there. I think it was put on the desktop. Okay, then you may have to go to back to the memory stick. Okay, is that, should we switch to my computer? Okay, all right. Sorry about that. Not surprising for the first talk of the conference. Okay, it actually looks like it's on this one. Yeah, final, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. I think I'm supposed to finish in just another few minutes, so let's go through this very quickly. First of all, I should let you know that there have been a number of people involved with this process. It's been very much a team effort. These have been students who've worked on various aspects of what I'm going to be reporting. And I should also thank you to Nobushimizu, who has been a wonderful colleague and has also helped us a great deal with the analytical work that I'm going to be reporting here. I think most of you would agree that in geochemical circles, we have a pretty good understanding of how the mantle melts in tectonic settings such as mid-ocean ridges and island arcs. But when you talk about volcanism or magmatism that's intraplate, usually in these features we refer to as large igneous provinces, the tendency has been for us to invoke plumes in just about every setting. Okay, so plumes have become the one mechanism that everybody seems to, well, lots of people seem to think is the way that these large igneous provinces form. What I'm going to do is, if I may go back for a minute, what I'm going to do is take a few of these features you see here and actually analyze water concentrations to see if flux melting may actually be an important process in how the magmatism originates. First of all, I remind you that everyone has seen cartoons of this sort, which purport to have subducted oceanic lithosphere, in some cases going all the way to the core-mantle boundary, and then it is subsequently remobilized to come back and form these plumes. And as I said a moment ago, this is where that large igneous provinces have been described as originating. Some have even gone as far as to describe situations where, in addition to deriving materials from the core-mantle boundary, there may be some ponding of material at the 670 discontinuity, which is then subsequently remobilized to form the ocean islands, some of which, in fact, are massive and are therefore large igneous provinces. But geophysics and mantle tomography in particular offers a very interesting perspective, whereby in some cases, our geophysics colleagues argue that, as in the case of Iceland, that you can actually image thermal anomalies going all the way to the core-mantle boundary, which gives the impression that, yes, we understand how these features originate at the core-mantle boundary, whereas others, using slightly different methods, say that it's very difficult to tell exactly where these features are coming from beyond the 670 discontinuity right here that we can image with some degree of confidence. So what I'm going to do is engage in the discussion, engage in the debate about the origins of these features by, first of all, looking at volatile concentrations in this large igneous province known as the Columbia River Plateau, which is adjacent to the Snake River Plain. And then I'll very quickly go to Iceland and look at some picritic rocks from that island, and finish off by going to this locality, which is the West Antarctic rift system, or WARS. So these are intraplate magmatic provinces, this one close to a continental margin, this one situated on a mid-ocean ridge, and this one in a rifted margin, which is in the area of the Paleo-Pacific margin of Gondwana. Okay, so starting with the Columbia River basalts and Snake River Plain, most of the people in the room will recall that this has been explained in terms of a plume source, which impinged itself against the lithosphere with some of the derivative magmas, at least according to this particular story, being transported in the shallow crust to very long distances to form the Columbia River basalts here. In time, that would be over the last 17 million years or so, this is the feature that has developed, a very large area of flood basalts, and just to the south and east of where the flood basalt province is, a feature that has been referred to as the Yellowstone hotspot track. And you can count time in millions of years. Volcanism here started at 16 million years, 14, and so on, all the way to the Yellowstone National Park here, where most of the rocks are erupting in real time. But we were, in my group, very impressed by the fact that the feature I just showed you developed in an area that has had a long history of subduction, creating this volcanic chain known as the Cascade Volcanic Arc. And not very far from there is where we see the Snake River Plain and Columbia River basalts developed. And the question for us was, could it be that the history of subduction along this margin actually has something to do with the massive amounts of melting that have taken place to produce this magmatic province? Now, I understand that I'm speaking to a mixed audience that may include low-temperature geochemists who don't think about melting inclusions on a daily basis. So let me take just a couple of seconds to explain what these features are. Basically, we have a crystal that's growing, and as it grows, it will have some imperfections, and those imperfections or little pockets are going to trap magma. So there's going to be skeletal growth, and skeletal growth of crystals can be triggered by any number of reasons, but among which would be undercooling, as an example, or a non-uniform supply of the nutrients that are being used to grow the crystal. And the remaining magma at the time this crystal is forming is going to exploit those little pockets that are forming and be trapped as the crystal continues to grow. Another way that we can form melting inclusions within minerals is a crystal growing, but then subsequently undergoing some resorption, and the embayments that form make for very convenient areas in which magmas can be trapped. And there are any number of others that, in the interest of saving time, I'm going to skip over. They are very important. These features are very important because they come closest to giving us the magmatic conditions at the time that crystallization is taking place. And on this cartoon, we can see a crystal, perhaps olivine crystal, that has trapped a melting inclusion that looks something like this. And in this first image, this would be the ideal situation. But a number of processes take place that make our lives a little bit difficult, requiring that we go through a whole series of processes before we can make any sense of the measurements that we are making. So, for example, there can be crystallization along the walls of the melting inclusion against the substrate of the host mineral, as shown in this dark ring right here. And secondly, we can have vapor bubbles developing, usually dominated by CO2 because of its very low solubility in silicate melts. And we can also have diffusive exchange between the melt inclusion and the host mineral. And we can also have volatiles leaking out of the melt inclusions because of the development of fractures like the ones shown here. And then finally, we can also have the problem of some of the melt inclusion actually crystallizing and forming these tiny little crystals that you see in here, making any measurement of volatiles rather challenging unless you realize that those crystallized melt inclusions can once again be homogenized if we heat the crystal to a temperature of about 1300 degrees in a piston cylinder at pressures of about 6 kilobars in order to prevent degassing from taking place. So we put a charge in a piston cylinder, homogenize the sample, and in so doing, we go from melt inclusions that look opaque like this because they are full of crystals to, following the experiment, the homogenization, looking at optically clear materials like this, which are homogeneous, and we can therefore go forward and make the measurements for the volatiles. Very quickly, let me point out that once the homogenization has been done, we measure major oxides to get the melt inclusion composition using electron microprobes, and we get volatiles using a couple of different methods. We can use FTIR, and we can also use secondary ionization mass spectrometry to get these 5 different volatiles. And we've also measured trace elements using laser ablation ICP-MS. Now, one thing I should emphasize here is that because of the possibilities of degassing and diffusion I just described on the previous slides, virtually all of the water concentrations I'm going to be looking at, either by FTR or by SIMS, happen to be minimum values, okay, because of this possibility of degassing through time. Now, before I show you the volatile data, let me point out that from the electron microprobe work, where we compare the compositions of the whole rocks described by or determined by XRF, what we discover invariably is that the melt inclusion compositions we get from the electron microprobe are quite often more primitive than the composition of the host magma. So this is a bulk rock being compared to a melt inclusion. They tend to be more primitive in many cases compared to the whole rock, which has evolved some, as you might imagine, because of the crystallization and fractional separation of the olivine in which we find the melt inclusions. So we've shown this in a number of places, but in the interest of saving time, I'm going to skip over this. I would be making exactly the same assessment with this data set as I just did on the previous diagram. The important thing I should point out is that degassing is a nemesis in these studies because of the fact that gases such as CO2 have very low solubilities, especially at low pressures, so that, as in this example for Kilauea volcano in Hawaii, by the time we get these magmas to the surface, a certain amount of degassing has already taken place. But one measure of how good the results are is CO2, which degasses very rapidly because of its low solubility. When we have very high concentrations of CO2, chances are very good that we're looking at the other volatile concentrations closest to what the magmatic conditions were. But again, I emphasize that it's inevitable that we're measuring minimum values. This diagram illustrates the point that degassing takes place at all sorts of stages as the crystal is brought to the surface. And it also shows that in order to make any sense of what the actual water concentrations of the primary magmas were, one has to use a statistical method by analyzing a minimum of some 20 melt inclusions, as illustrated here. Only very few of those inclusions are going to retain very high concentrations. Others are going to lose their water through various processes, either during the eruption, during crystallization, and possibly even during the homogenization experiments in the lab. Okay, so very quickly, let me show you that in looking at the Columbia River basalts and the Snake River Plain, we have water concentrations in the Columbia River basalts that exceed full weight % water, so a huge amount of water. And within the Snake River Plain, we have water concentrations maxing out at about 3.3 weight %. And again, I would argue that these are minimum values. The actual water concentrations and magmatic conditions are probably even higher than this. So again, I would invoke the idea that flux melting, even in situations like this where plumes have been invoked, may be very important processes. Now, let me finish off talking about the Columbia River basalts by pointing out that when we compare water concentrations to an element like cerium, which has similar incompatibility to water, we see a very nice relationship like this. As the water concentrations go down, the water to cerium ratio go down. This is a typical example of degassing. As the water amount goes down, this ratio is going down while cerium is really not evolving, and so we see a trend that looks like this, meaning that we are losing water, and therefore points way over here come closest to telling us what the magmatic conditions were. Okay, moving on to the next tectonic setting. This is Iceland, which sits on top of the mid-ocean ridge, not very far from Greenland. We can see, I'm going to speak of only just the green dots, which show the trace of, or the track of this hotspot, starting out about 70 million years ago over here and ending up on the eastern edge of Iceland today. Work in Iceland is just getting underway, but Mary Peterson, who may actually be in the audience here, was a student at the University of Michigan when I was there, and we analyzed a few samples from the southwestern ridge of Iceland, and in that particular place where we have picritic compositions for magmas, we find 3 weight % water. Now, this is the tip of the iceberg. We need to understand this a little bit better, and therefore 2 weeks ago we spent a great deal of time going all over the island to be able to do a regional study of all of this volcanism. If you look at the melt inclusion compositions in Iceland, they are indeed basaltic. Some of them are within the pickrite compositional field, and when you look at trace elements within these melt inclusions, they show us some very interesting relationships. Number one, take note of the fact that we've divided them into 2 groups, one that has high water concentrations, anywhere from 0.6 to 3 weight % water, and we are comparing those to the lower water concentration melt inclusions, anywhere from 0.2 to 0.5 weight %. And the thing that strikes you right away is that the water-rich melt inclusions actually have light rare earth element depletions that are considerably less than the light rare earth element depletions we see in the water-poor melt inclusions. This is, oops, sorry, I went to punch the wrong button. This is chondrite normalized, this is a value of 10, and this is a value of 1. So considerably more depleted in the light rare earth elements in this diagram compared to these melt inclusions with high water. So in other words, the water characteristics we're looking at here have to be a primary feature of the magma rather than being a superficial imprint that has been added by subsequent alteration. Another detail that's quite interesting is that within group of these melt inclusions, we see increasing water concentrations corresponding to actually increasing trace element abundances as well. A similar observation has been made using other trace elements, particularly the large iron lithophile elements. High water, we see values for rubidium, barium, niobium around 1, and low water concentrations, we see tremendous depletions in those same elements as you see repeated here. Okay, and let's see, I better speed up because I think I have to be done. What did you say, Paul? Was it 9:25? Okay, or maybe 9:20, I'll try to do that. Another interesting relationships is that similar trends for the various elements which have different incompatibilities, comparing cerium to ytterbium to samarium, we see that similar trends are maintained, and therefore we would say that these characteristics have to be representing the source rather than some crystal fractionation, which if it were to be the case, one would not expect these elements to be behaving exactly the same way. So this has to be a primary feature of the magmas. Okay, and the third locality is the West Antarctic Rift System, which for those of you who may not remember your geography of the Southern Ocean very well, I'll point out is a feature that developed right between the East Antarctic Craton here and the microplates that were amalgamated together to form what is known as the West Antarctic microplate amalgamation. The volcanism in this particular rift started about 90 million years ago, and we have taken samples, as I'm going to show you, from land, but also from the ocean or from the Ross Sea right here. And the volatile measurements we are making are really just getting underway. And I can already say that, although I'm not prepared to project the actual diagrams of these concentrations, that we are receiving or we are seeing frighteningly large amounts of water that are very similar to what we find in island arcs. Looking at this diagram, you may not have a good understanding of how large this area is, and therefore on the next diagram, I decided to project the continent of Antarctica next to North America at the same scale to show you that the West Antarctic Rift System is actually as large as the Basin and Range Province in the western United States and Canada. Okay, so these lines defining the West Antarctic Rift System are superimposed on the North American continent, and we see that it's a very, very large area. This is also an area of intraplate magmatism, but developed in a very thinned crust because of the extension that has taken place. And in this place, plume activity has also been invoked. And so we wondered, are we looking at plume magmatism, or is this a feature that could also be somehow related to subduction? Interestingly, it is not only Antarctica where we see that possibility of subduction contributing to the magmas. This is an outline of the western margin of Antarctica, and this is a margin outlining the eastern portions of the Australian Craton. And what has been observed from mantle tomography is that there is a very large area within the Southern Ocean, as you see here, that has anomalously low seismic velocities. And the question has been, are we looking at a thermal anomaly in this case, or are we looking at the possibility that the mantle here is particularly wet? The reason we would entertain the possibility of wetness along this particular margin is that when we go back to Gondwana times, and this is the reconstruction from 185 million years ago, the Paleo-Pacific margin of Gondwana had a long-standing history of subduction, lasting probably something like 300 or 400 million years. We have evidence of subduction at 500 million years ago, and we have evidence of subduction proceeding or continuing all the way until about 100 million years ago, when New Zealand and Australia started separating away from Antarctica or from Gondwana. So there is a very long history of subduction along this margin, and the samples we collected that I'm going to show you come from this part of the world, now rearranged so that we no longer have subduction, but instead we have extension. So the motivation for looking at rocks derived from this area was asking the question, with such a long history of subduction lasting over 300, 400 million years, do we have any evidence of the mantle having imprinted by subduction processes, ions being given off by dehydration reactions and so on? So what we did was take a cruise and collect a bunch of subaerial samples from islands like this one in the middle of the Ross Sea, and another island that looks something like this, but also went ahead and did multi-beam bathymetry mapping of the Ross Sea and identified a number of volcanic edifices on the ocean floor and went ahead and simply dredged them. Okay, so some of the results we have are based on the dredging that you see illustrated here. The compositions are a lot more alkalic than the ones that we looked at in Iceland and also in the Columbia River basalt and Snake River plain. The dominant rock composition is basanite, both for the host magmas and also the melt inclusions. And what's interesting as we look at this volcanism in West Antarctica is that if you look at the regional geotherms, this one for McMurdo area and this one for northern Victoria land, there's absolutely no way you're going to create large volumes of magmas such as we see in the West Antarctic Rift System if the source you're going to derive these magmas from is either a dry peridotite, this is the dry peridotite solidus, or even if you were to have a small amount of water such as 0.48%. It just cannot give us the volumes of melting that we need in order to create this magmatic province. So what we've done is taken the most primitive melt compositions that we can find in the West Antarctic Rift System and compared them to some experimental melts that various colleagues have published over the years, including garnet pyroxenites melted at different pressures in the mantle, well, in the lab, but simulating mantle conditions, and also comparing these to enriched peridotites or peridotites with a basaltic component and so on. To cut a long story short, when we look at major oxides, we find that our most primitive melt compositions shown in the gray circles, these match most appropriately with sources of materials such as garnet pyroxenites, or one could also make the argument that they could be derived from compositions which are barely making it into the field of view in these slides, and those would be carbonated peridotites. So in other words, this would be peridotite that has a significant amount of volatile within it, and with fractionation of olivine, we can then move the derived magmas from an area such as over here much closer to where we find these compositions today. Now, I'm not going to have the time to talk about isotopes very much. I'm very mindful of the fact that you need to be somewhere in 5 minutes, and therefore I'm going to try and wrap up here. But what these lavas in the West Antarctic Rift System remind us of, at least looking at neodymium and hafnium, is that they're very similar to the so-called high mu compositions that we find in the ocean basins. Looking at lead, on the other hand, we find that these compositions are something like 19.5. They're not exactly high mu, which would be over here above 21. We think that this is a secondary feature, at least with respect to lead. The reason we think so is that when we look at the profile of trace element distributions like this, we find that there is a huge negative lead anomaly. Initially, we were startled by this. We made measurements using ICP-MS and decided to verify this using isotope dilution to make sure that this was a real feature that we could hang our hats on. We think that this feature developed as a result of essentially, should we say, volatile mobile elements being mobilized in a subduction zone environment that I described as having existed for some 400 million years along the Paleo-Pacific margin of Gondwana. So I'll skip over this and just point out that it looks like pyroxenites, garnet pyroxenites, or carbonated peridotite, no doubt hydrated as well, give us the best explanation for the major elements and the trace elements that we are seeing in the magmatism along this margin of West Antarctica. So in conclusion, let me point out that there is significant amounts of water in 3 different intraplate settings, tectonic settings that we've looked at in Columbia River basalts, in Iceland, and also in West Antarctica. We have massive amounts of water, making it possible for us to say that flux melting has to be an important process in areas which have previously been attributed to mantle plumes, which, by the way, many geophysicists are having a hard time in some places quantifying in terms of having a robust thermal anomaly. I would also say that it's important to point out that a large number of these melt inclusions in any sample have been substantially degassed, and therefore for you to be able to tell roughly how close we can get to magmatic conditions, it requires that one uses the population method by analyzing a minimum of 20 melt inclusions before you get a pretty good handle on how much water there might be. The one point I didn't get a chance to make is that the highest volatile concentrations occur in our most primitive melt inclusions. Again, emphasizing the point that this has to be a mantle property rather than concentration of water due to fractional crystallization processes. And then combining the data that we've produced on water and other volatiles with previous studies documenting, for example, high barium concentrations and also high osmium 187, 188 in the place of Iceland, for example, and mobile elements having moved around in the West Antarctic Rift System, we would suggest that these are properties which must originate from the recycling of oceanic crust to relatively shallow levels in the mantle and then getting remobilized to produce the magmas that we see today. So that flux melting is actually quite important in all of these 3 areas we've looked at. So mantle, upper mantle, has to be quite rich in water. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam, for a very nice talk. We can take a couple of questions. There are some microphones in the alleys if you'd like.
most people are running off.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow for the next plenary session.